Just make sure the recording's working. All right, so today's first thing, no, the papers aren't all graded yet. I was traveling over spring break, and then I spent much of this week traveling again for a funeral, so I have not been able to finish the grading. You'll get them next Friday. So just hang on for another week. Thank you all for being patient. One less thing to worry about. All right, so that's the business stuff. Now today's topic is censorship and regulation. So let me double check something real quick and make sure that I'm teaching you all the correct thing. Otherwise, that would be very embarrassing.
It is a topic, Professor.
Okay, good. Just making sure I didn't mess it up. All right, good. I got terrified though. This is again why I need 6 more weeks of break. But anyway, censorship regulation. These are 2 words that you've probably seen before in some setting. So let's just define them together as a group. So what, first off, is censorship? Or what is it to censor something? Anyone know? All right, so when yeah.
Could it also be related to betting something? To when you are I want to say I forgot the train of thought. When you want to I guess clean things up, could that be
So it's Cynthia and Jorge are along the right line. Cynthia says blocking out information. So when you're censoring something, what you're doing is preventing people from accessing that information. So if has anyone seen one of those government documents where like names or things are blacked out? So it'll look something like this. It'll be like
yes,
the defendant and then this would be like a big black box, claims. So anytime something's blacked out, that is censoring it. Or the beeping on TV. So if I was just like, beep off, that is censoring. That is just the definition of censoring. Or I remember a few years back, there was somebody working in the government who didn't like that there were naked statues in their office area, so they put little leaves over top of their crotches. That's censoring. What is regulating or regulation? These 2 are definitely related, but they're this is a more specific term. This one's a bit more general. Does anyone know what regulating is, or to regulate something? Yeah, so it's constantly checking it. And specifically what you're doing is you're just checking it and controlling it to some degree. So instead of just letting it run wild, you check to make sure what it's supposed to be doing. So instead of just, if something is regulated, you basically have an oversight body that comes along and makes sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So for instance, in the United States, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is a regulation body that overlooks banks. So, and CEOs and that sort of thing. So there are rules about what you're allowed to do. You might also say that the law enforcement regulates the community or has regulating powers over the community. You can say that the United Nations regulates international relations, or they have regulation over it. Also, you could say that things like your behaviors in John Jay are regulated because there's a set of rules you have to follow, and then there are security guards watching it. Jorge.
Oh yeah, Professor, I was going to say, can this also be that you need to meet the standards? You need to meet the standards.
Absolutely. So regulation, one thing you can do is you can say something like, if you don't meet these standards, you are not going to be allowed to be here. Basically, regulation is any type of practice or system in place that involves putting an effort to make sure things run in a certain way. So another thing you could say is taxing. That is regulation. Or, for instance, in the United States, a parole officer, like if you leave state lines, you're not allowed to, then you have to go back to jail. Or if you want to stay A lot of schools have this, where scholarships are regulated, where if you get a scholarship, but you fail all your classes, they will take away your scholarship or kick you out of the school. All of that is regulation. Regulation is just any sort of general practice that organizes and keeps things. You can think of a teacher in like an elementary school. They provide regulation over the students. So an unregulated system is one where just things run wild and anything goes and nothing is at all controlled. So for instance, if you know, compare the difference between like a school with a teacher, and then as soon as the teacher leaves the room, all chaos happens, like things go crazy. That is because it is no longer regulated, is one way of thinking of it. So regulation and censorship. Those are our topics for today. So with this in mind, why are regulation and censorship things, one, worth talking about in general, and two, specifically worth talking about in the context of the internet and cyber technology? Anyone have any thoughts for why these things come up? Or you can even come up with a particular instance in which these things have come up recently, news stories. So Cynthia says, because people shouldn't be able to say anything. So yeah, this is one issue with the internet and with modern technology, is modern technology has changed the way we communicate with each other in major ways. We've talked about this all semester. We can now talk to people halfway around the world instantly. You can now talk to me, even though you are currently in your house and I'm currently in my house, and we are miles apart from each other. But because of internet technology, we're able to communicate. And one of the major things that gets censored or regulated are what we say to each other. So as the way we talk to each other changes, questions about what we should and shouldn't be allowed to say have fundamentally shifted because of the nature of communication changing. And Cynthia says, yeah, there are certain sorts of things that it seems like we shouldn't be allowed to say. So there are certain things that, as a matter of fact, in the United States, that are illegal to say. But most countries around the world have limits on what you are allowed to say and what you aren't allowed to say. And these are why the things come up in the context of the internet. What are some either particular examples of things that have come up along these topics, or other issues that kind of suggest why we're talking about these things in this class? Does anyone have any examples of regulation or censorship happening within the past, I don't know, 4 months? Yeah, Twitter and Trump is a big one. Jorge, you were gonna say something?
Professor, I was thinking about on the other side, the lack of regulation and censorship.
Yeah, so here's
where we have all this sorts of, I think you were talking about privacy concerns. What we do is being monitored and we've been targeted, either as customers but our information is out there to be collected and sell,
Yeah, so that's one thing, is there's basically this question of, there's a few different things that come up. One is what we say, and another is what we do, or more importantly, what others do. So one thing that we're finding is the internet, more so than anywhere else, is really one of the least regulated things that has existed in a long time. And because of this, we have this issue of, we want there to be some level of regulation. But what we find is there really isn't much regulation. And what ends up happening is, for instance, what Jorge was bringing up from classes before about how our information is being collected, stored, and sold in what are largely unregulated ways. So this raises the question of, should these things be regulated? How should they be regulated? Why should they be regulated? And who should do the regulating? So it seems like where we are is, a lot of things on the internet are just completely unregulated. And we're starting to get a push in which new sorts of regulation is coming along that has never existed before. So for instance, there has been censorship of people like Trump, but this was one of the first. Think about how far it had to go before Twitter decided to kick Trump off of it. And then there's another worry of, should it really be Twitter who is doing the kicking off of Trump? Is it really the place of a private company who's operating for their own economic well-being? Should they really be the ones deciding what should and shouldn't be said on the internet? And there's been a lot of, there's also been a lot of censorship for with COVID, because we don't want people leaking false information. And so there's this big issue here of, on the one side, we have regulation. In terms of the what we say bit, on the one side, we have regulation of info. And what's the flip side? If you don't think what people say should be regulated, what do we typically call that? I'll give you a clue. What is it? If you don't believe that anything should be regulated, speaking wise, there is a phrase with a 4-letter word and a 6-letter word, and I'll give you a clue that it has a lot of E's in it. Anyone know what the opposite? If you don't think things should be regulated, so there is no A. There's actually, the only vowel is E. Anyone know what?
Free speech?
Yeah, free speech. So there's our C. Free speech is the opposite of regulation. So if a system is completely regulated, what you have on the opposite side is there's no freedom of speech. Everything you say should be controlled. But on the other side, complete freedom of speech means you're allowed to say whatever you want. And so another reason why regulation is a hot button topic, or something that's really worth talking about, is on the one hand, we all value some degree of regulation, but we also all have this sense that free speech is important. So what do we mean by free speech here? What is free speech? What is it to have the right to free speech? Yeah, it's basically the right to say what you want without being punished for it. And so most societies in the modern world allow a certain degree of free speech. Nobody allows complete free speech, but different nations exist on a different scale of how much. And generally, the more things are regulated, the less free speech there is. And the more free speech there is, the less things are regulated. And what we find is every one of us has views about how far the regulation should go. But there's a big issue that comes up of how far, like, where should you draw the line between acceptable free speech and not acceptable free speech? And so what we're finding these days with the internet is it's a new battleground of where you should, what things you should be allowed to say and what things you shouldn't. And what we're finding is that more and more people are worrying that maybe things which were okay to say 20 years ago aren't okay and should be regulated. While other people are saying, no, 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 we should not be over-regulating the internet. So there's really two big questions that come up with the internet and regulation. Is just how much regulation should we have, which is really a theoretical question. So this is like a big picture, what should be allowed. And then on the flip side, though, is how, or another issue is how do we even successfully regulate? So if we all agree that there should be some degree of regulation, there's still a question of who should be in charge of it and how do we put it in place. And what we find is the internet is much harder to regulate, and things on the internet are much harder to regulate than more or less anything else that's ever existed in the world. The internet is, and I know that's a grand claim, that the internet is the hardest thing to regulate in human history. But in a certain sense, and what I want to do this class is really show why it is so much harder to regulate and why I think I'm right in saying it is the hardest thing to regulate that has ever existed in human history. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, are really these questions: is how much regulation should we have, and how would we even make the regulation work? And what we're going to actually do is look at this one first and look at why is it so hard to regulate the internet, and understand the sorts of practical implications that come up and the sort of ethical issues that come up with questions like Twitter banning Trump or Facebook not banning misinformation about coronavirus and that sort of thing. So that's the general background stuff. I'm now going to jump into the why is it so damn hard to regulate the internet? So everyone, generally, that start was kind of messy, but there's really no structure. It's just putting up different things tied in with regulation and censorship and kind of pointing to a few of the issues that really come up in this topic with the modern cyber technology. So any questions, comments, concerns at this point?
Nope.
Okay, awesome. All right, so so the first issue that comes up when talking about regulating the internet is really basically the issue is this. There's two types of things that in our history we have regulated, and we have a straightforward understanding of how we go about regulating these things. The first of these are media, or singular, a medium, and the other ones are spaces, or a space. So first off, let's start here. What do we mean by space? And I mean this in the most practical or everyday sort of sense. When you're talking about a space or a place, what are you talking about? And this is almost so common sense that it can be hard to put a definition on it.
In person.
Yeah, we're talking about an area that you interact with in person. It's literally just like a three-dimensional area you can measure. So basically, we have this notion of a space or a place. It's just an area that you could measure with a measuring stick. Now, do we regulate spaces or areas? You can think of some spaces that are regulated.
Yes. Indoors, like there's like rules that you have to follow. Like outdoors, like the park, where like, oh, you have to clean up after your dog and everything.
Yeah, there are rules governing these spaces, and the way they apply is they're applied to anyone who is in that physical space, physically speaking. So for instance, if you're in a public park, this is you, and your dog poops right there, because you're within that space, those rules apply. There are also rules and different rules for different types of spaces. So for instance, in a church, that church has certain rules. Within a school, there are certain things you're not allowed to say, which you might be allowed to say in front of like your family at home. There are certain things you're allowed to do in your house, in your bedroom, that you're legally not allowed to do out in public. Another one is bathroom, like a public space. The rules that apply to that public space are different than the rules that apply to the restroom. You can do things in a restroom you're not allowed to do in a public park. So that's the thing. When you're regulating a space, you control what is allowed to be done inside. But what's another element of it? There's another way in which spaces are regulated. It's not just what you're allowed to do inside. There's another question. So think about think back to the times that you actually went into a physical school building. When you get to the door, very often, who's waiting on the other side of that door? For those of you who have been in a security guard. So there's not just a matter of what you're allowed to do. Spaces are also regulated based on who's allowed to enter them in the first place. So one of the main things about regulating space is you can literally put up barriers that keep people out. So for instance, in a bookstore, or a better one, in a supermarket that also has an alcohol section, there's basically going to be doors, and you're not allowed to enter it unless you're over the age of 21. You can think of any sort of like wine or spirits or alcohol distribution service as not allowing you to enter it unless you're over a certain age. So when you regulate space, what you're doing is controlling who can get into a space and what they're allowed to do once they're inside. And so basically, if you've got something, some information you don't want someone to have, with when you're regulating a space, so to give like a really strong example, here's the Pentagon. Let's actually draw it well. For those who don't know, what is the Pentagon? I actually think it looks something like this. What goes on in the Pentagon? Yes.
Yeah, you see high level government like military stuff.
Yeah, it's the Department of Defense is housed in the Pentagon, which is down in Virginia. And basically, unless you have a certain level of security clearance, you aren't allowed inside the Pentagon. And the reason they have this in place is to make sure that, because once you're inside the Pentagon, people will talk freely about certain things in certain areas. So the way you keep this information secure, to make sure the average person doesn't get that information, is you just prevent them from getting inside the building in the first place. So that's how you regulate a space. You don't let people into areas they shouldn't, and once they're in, you control what they do. Now, regulating a medium. Now, how many people have heard the sense, and this is medium in the sense of media. So when we're talking about a medium, does anyone know what a medium is? If not, I can go on to my example that makes it a little clearer. Marcus.
I think it's like basically like to talk through something. Yeah, like somebody said like news channels. Anything that like it's like talking through a phone. Like the medium is the phone. Like that's the example I can think of.
Yeah, a medium is a way in which information gets passed along. So news channels are an example of it, but a more general sense is the telephone or the TV station itself, or the TV distribution itself. So why did I draw a ghost up here? This is a ghost. Well, how many people have heard of a medium in the context of ghosts? Has anyone heard this expression?
Yeah, usually with like it's like in movies with like all the horror movies where like you talk into something or whatever and like you ask the Ouija board.
Exactly. That's what we're talking about here. So when we're talking about a medium, what it is the medium is the way in which the ghost speaks to the world. So you can think of it as here's you, an average person, here's the ghost. And then the medium is the person through whom the ghost speaks. The medium is the person who has the special ability to allow the ghost to talk through them to the normal people. So in the same way, when we're talking about a medium, the radio station is the way through which someone on the other end communicates to you. The television is the way through which the people creating the content get that content to you. So that's what we mean by a medium in this sense. And mediums, or more accurately, media, are regulated. In the United States, what sorts of things are regulated? In what ways are media regulated?
They have to censor like curse words.
Yeah, there's certain sorts of things that are censored. So for instance, and it's not just like censoring, it's very often it's censoring particular things at particular times. So for instance, you aren't allowed to play porn at 10 p.m. on a Saturday on anything. Yeah, graphic videos. Also, you can't necessarily, if you're going to show something very violent, you're going to have to put some viewers may find this violent. Please look away if you do not want to be disturbed. So these are the ways you censor media. Another thing is you have to release on the radio. What is the way in which the radio is regulated, or things on the radio get censored?
Usually the radio, I think you can't talk about some things. Like if you try to like put your opinion out there, it's really bad.
Yeah, and also just like on a music radio station, there's the clean version of the song that they can play on the radio, and then there's the dirty version of the song they're not allowed to play. So just think of Cardi B lyrics. There's a reason that there's always two versions of her songs, because some of them, the media, it's not allowed to be played on the media of a radio. So basically the way that a medium gets regulated is it's not that you prevent people from accessing it. It's rather that you change what is out there or put on it, or they beep it out. So very often there's a, the beeping sound, and no explicit audio. Yeah. So in a space, what you do is you can have, I guess, naughty things or things that you want regulated, and it's allowed to be there. You just prevent people from getting to it. Because the idea with a medium is anybody can be contacted through that medium, you actually have to change what is on there. And you have to say, these things just cannot even exist through this medium. So in a space, the things can exist, and the way you regulate it is you just prevent people from getting to it. With a medium, you instead say, because a child knows how to turn on the television, you can't even put this sort of information on there. It cannot exist and be accessed through this medium. So that's the difference between space. By space, you create areas that people cannot go and doors that they can't get through to prevent them from getting there. With a medium, because there's no physical walls, you instead just say the things you don't want people to access, you just cannot put them or deliver them through this medium. So everyone understand that difference here between regulating a space and regulating a medium. Is the general difference clear to people? If you have any questions about it, now's the time to ask.
I think I'm good.
Okay. So I just talked about spaces and I just talked about media. Now, why am I talking about this in a cyber ethics class? Specifically, why are we talking about this in the context of regulating the internet?
Because usually with technology now, like with the internet, anybody can say anything, and like things get real bad. That's why we have two different versions of internet. You got the regular everyday version, and then you got the dark web.
And that itself is another messy thing. But basically, let's just zoom up a level. We said things that go in the medium category are TV, radio, anything like that. And things that are spaces are physical spaces with addresses and places you can go. So given that definition, where does the internet go? Is the internet a medium or is the internet a space?
I think it's a space, Professor. It's like a cyberspace, as we say.
So on the one hand, it's a cyberspace. It seems like we talk about the internet as a space that you can keep people in and out of. You can put up passwords. You can do things like that. Does anyone, though, feel that it's more of a medium?
Yeah, it's kind of more, it's like in between mostly, because like it takes both parts, because like you said, like we could keep people out, like oh, they can't, if they don't pay the bill, you don't have internet, right? But at the same time, if you just pay the bill and you have the access, you can just talk to like anybody, like just go on Reddit or Facebook or whatever, and you can connect to everybody.
Jorge, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Professor, also I was thinking it's like a merge of the two, could be, right? When you talk about a social media platform, it's considered a space, but it's also a medium, you know?
And that's, Jorge, you put that beautifully, and that's exactly the point. It looks like when you look at the internet, it is both in certain elements like a medium and certain elements like a space, because there are addresses, you can put up passwords. But on the flip side, because the internet is like, does anyone know, physically speaking, what the internet actually looks like? How is it that you and I can communicate to each other via the internet right now?
Usually just a bunch of routers and machines.
Yeah, there's a bunch of routers that collect airwaves in our house, but then they connect to literal physical wires. Running underneath the oceans are fiber optic cables that pass along electricity in much the same way as a phone line. They are literally physical pieces of infrastructure that information passes along. So in just the same way that a medium relies on physical connections and anything that goes along that line can get to another place, it's the same with the internet. There was a story about a decade ago in which the nation of Armenia, large parts of it lost their internet because a little old lady was out in her garden, gardening for potatoes, hit a fiber optic cable and knocked it out for a day. So it's a literal physical infrastructure. However, on the other side, it does have these elements of space. We talk about a website the website has an address, the HTTP address, the World Wide Web address. There's also an element in which we talk about going onto a certain website. We don't talk about we can talk about flipping to a channel, but we don't talk about being on a certain news site. Rather, we watch the news. On the internet, you go to or you're on a certain website. So in a certain sense, the way to regulate the internet gets treated like a space in a lot of contexts. So for instance, if you try to go to an adult website, what happens? What are you greeted by when you try to click on it?
Warning 18 plus most of the time.
Exactly, a warning 18 plus. So on the one hand, we're treating that as a space. However, contrast, what's the difference between trying to get into a liquor store when you're 12 and trying to get onto an internet porn site when you're 12? What's the major difference? If you try to get on, if you were 12 years old and you weren't wearing a disguise and you tried to walk into a liquor store, what would happen?
Oh, you probably get kicked out.
Yeah, you'd immediately get kicked out because they see you and they have a physical barrier. On the internet, what happens when you a 12-year-old tries to get on a porn site? What are they going to do?
They could do anything really, because like as long as there's like there's like not, I don't think they could the internet people, like the site, can actually do anything because all they see is an IP address.
Yeah. So here's the thing. On the one hand, we're regulating it like a space, but there's also this fundamental difference when you're on the internet of you don't see that the person trying to get on. All you can go with is just like this little check mark box. Like, yes, I am over 18. Or, this next video contains graphic information or graphic content. Are you okay with this? We just click yes. So on the one hand, we're treating it like a space, but the ease of getting that information is much more similar to a medium. In a medium, all you do is turn on the television. In this case, all you do is check the yes, I'm over 21 box, and all of a sudden anything is possible. So there's this weird thing where the internet is just incredibly hard to regulate just because of its nature as this somewhat space, somewhat medium type thing. Another issue with it is what Marcus brought up, which is that regulating the internet as a space, it seems like in a physical space, it's because like actual physical space is very limited and you can only be in a particular space at one time. It's hard to, or it's at least somewhat harder to create alternative spaces for people to enter. On the internet, though, there are websites that are created that are completely untraceable, untrackable to the average human, and it's very hard to keep people out. So in a physical space, you can just, make it very, very difficult to create a space in which people talk about child pornography or exchange child pornography. On the internet, it's much easier to create spaces that are unregulated because the internet doesn't exist in a physical space. Because it's more of a medium and all you have to do is put information out there, it can be very, very difficult to actually control what is on the internet. So does everyone understand how this problem arises of we know how to regulate a medium. It's not always perfect, but we get the general gist. We know how to regulate a space, but we have no framework for regulating something that is both a medium and a space. Because it's like a space, if we try to use the medium way of regulating, it ends up feeling almost over-controlled. Because, like on the internet, think about if like Facebook just said no more saying things X, Y, and Z. That would seem a bit of overkill. It seems like on the internet, you should have control over your website. However, on the flip side, if we start regulating it in the way we regulate spaces, don't come in here unless you're over 18, the medium elements make that sort of regulation very ineffective. So what we end up with is just this practical, incredibly difficult way of regulating because of the nature of the internet itself, as something that's not quite a space, but has space-like properties, and is not quite a medium, but has medium-like properties. So does everyone understand just this practical issue that comes up of just like, how do you regulate something that's both a space and a medium? And the fact is we don't have good answers to this question.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, so now I want to talk about the next difficulty, which is basically that the main ways we have of regulating things, none of them work especially well with the internet. We have 4 main practices for regulating, and because of the nature of the internet, none of them can be used without raising either practical or ethical issues. So the first way we often regulate things is the law. What is it to regulate things by the law or use the law for regulation? What does this entail?
Government interaction.
Yeah, basically, a government comes in and says certain things are allowed and certain things are not allowed. So what are some things that the law regulates in the United States today? And there are many, so just give me some examples.
Marijuana.
Marijuana, that is one the
drugs.
law is changing around it, but that's a classic case. Gun
Like-
control,
Yeah, underage drinking. You know?
drinking, any sort of alcohol consumption. What else do we have?
Nudity, I think. Like,
Yeah, there are laws around nudity. There are places you're allowed to be nude and places you're not. Gambling is another very good one, Howard. What else do we have here? Basically, anything that you can think of a law for is regulation. So just think of things that are regulated or things that have a law tied to it. So we've got gambling, nudity, gun control. Driving is a really good one. You know, there are certain things you are and aren't allowed to do on the road. You know, you have to
Right.
drive on the right.
Oh yeah,
Like-
Professor, even the interactions you have with other people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you're not allowed to touch somebody or, you know,
Yeah, you're not allowed to just walk up to someone and punch them in the face because you don't like them. That is regulated. Also, environmental protections are another one. You're not just allowed to, if you have a refrigerator, you're not allowed to just go out in the woods and throw it away. It's against the law. Getting a job or hiring someone is highly regulated. What are some ways in which getting a job is regulated or hiring someone is regulated?
laws like against discrimination.
Yeah, in the United States, it is illegal to not hire someone because of the color of their skin. You aren't allowed to say that person is black, therefore I will not hire them. That is regulated. You have to take somebody on the merits of their application, not their skin color. All of these are regulations. All of these are ways in which things are regulated by law. Now, I want to talk about the pros and the cons of regulating things by law, and specifically, what is good about regulating by law and what is bad about it, and especially, why is it that attempting to regulate things by the law doesn't work great in the context of the internet or in the context of cyber technology? So what are the good things about regulating by law, first off? Why do we like it?
it allows people to be more safe, general masses to be safer.
Yeah, it improves safety, and especially it's very clear to those general masses. Granted, there are some laws that are very vague, but generally it's written down somewhere. You know what is and isn't allowed. We also have more control. So on the one hand, when the law is in place, it makes society more controlled, but also at least in a democratic society, there's a certain degree in which we have control over the laws themselves. Granted, when it runs properly, that's the case. We don't have complete control. We vote for people who then make the laws, but we at least have some voting power over what the laws are. But what
Oh,
are
yeah.
some,
Professor, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I was going to
No,
say
no.
also, like, we as a society decide, we get to decide sort of what is legal and what is not. And it could change, as the decades go by.
can change. So these are all the things we like about the law. It can change. We have control. We decide on them. But what are some of the problems? Especially what are some of the problems that arise in the context of controlling the internet or regulating internet content or cyber technology in general? What are some of the issues that the law has in these cases? Well, here's one. How many of you, does anyone remember that old, like, were you forced to watch that old Schoolhouse Rock video about how a law gets passed? Did anyone else have to, or am I showing my age by talking about that? So a lot of people do. Yeah, that old, like, first bill, blah, 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 blah. So everyone remember to some degree that video. Those of you who remember, how long does it take for a law to get passed in the United States of America? You don't have to give it in terms of numbers, just generally short,
Years.
long, immediate. Yeah, years, a long, long time. How quickly does cyber technology change?
Constantly, actually.
Really, really fast, really, really constantly. So one of the first issues with regulating things by law is that the law cannot keep up with the technology. So we've got this issue of laws are slow, tech is fast. So what often happens is the practices will get in place and the pieces of technology will come into existence and the law isn't able to keep up. So to go back to the example that Jorge was talking about before with data mining and collecting of data, if we could all get together and quickly pass a law around data protection, it's very unlikely that we would allow companies to collect quite as much information as they do about us, or at least use it in the ways they do. However, because the United States takes so long, by the time we have laws getting passed to deal with a certain issue, that issue is no longer something which the technology companies even care about. So there was a famous case where the Supreme Court made this judgment on what sorts of information could be collected on pagers. So do people know what pagers are? They were like a pre-cell phone thing where you basically strapped it onto your belt and somebody would call your pager would show the number that they called you on, and then you would go to a phone and call them from that thing. You would see the number and then you call them from the phone. So the reason I bring up pagers is there was a Supreme Court case that basically they finally decided about what information could be collected about pagers about a decade after anyone was using pagers. So by the time the Supreme Court decided what was and wasn't allowed, their decision was completely irrelevant because pagers didn't ever get used anymore. In the same way that it would be like, what are you allowed to do? It would be like the Supreme Court just today deciding, all right, these are the laws around what information you're allowed to collect using a flip phone. It's like, okay, great. Nobody has a flip phone except for your grandmother. So these are the sorts of issues that come up. And another flip side of that, because it takes the laws can change, so that's a good thing. But because they take a while to change, what can end up happening is the laws get applied in ways that are very, very confusing or don't actually seem to match up well. So for instance, we're going to talk possibly later in class, depending on time, things like sexting. Sexting is something which in some sense has to be regulated. There are major issues with pornography websites that are posting videos without the consent of the people depicted in those videos. And we don't want, like, if you send somebody a naked picture of yourself privately, you don't then want that posted on the internet. So it has to be regulated. However, what we're finding is in a lot of cases, the laws that are being applied in these cases are laws that don't take into account the modern nature of technology, like the fact that everybody has a camera. So there was this case back in like 2006 where some 14-year-olds sent nude photos of themselves to some 16-year-olds, both of them, like a freshman in high school and a junior in high school. Say what you will about the problems of this. This sort of thing is not the same thing as taking small children in sexual positions and making pornographic images of those children. Like, say what you will about the problems around sexting between teenagers. It's not the same thing as a fully grown adult having sex with a child and making photography of it. And yet these children were charged with distributing child pornography. So because the only laws we had in place were the general child pornography laws from before the time of the smartphone, these children were being charged with felonies for sending nude photos to other people who were, around their age. And you might wonder, like, oh, this is a case in which we need a new law, but the law can't keep up. What are some other issues with the law as a means for regulating?
Sometimes they're actually, I don't know, because like sometimes like they if the law is generalized, it's like they have the power to whoever made the law has the power to govern, like give out punishment. But at the same time, most of the time now it's usually like governed like with rules and like other like by the people.
So you said a couple different things, Marcus, there. I'm going to take one of them and run, specifically your word punishment. Why does a law work? Why is it that speeding is in a car? Why is it that our law around speeding works? What happens if you speed?
Either tickets, fines, jail time.
Yeah, you get in trouble, and there's a people in place, law enforcement, whose job it is to punish those who break those laws. So what would happen if all of a sudden one day all cops decided, you know what, we're not going to give anyone a ticket for speeding. We just don't care. What would happen on the roads?
Most likely, people are going to have accidents.
Yeah, people are going to start speeding everywhere. Just like in New York City, what is a law that nobody bothers enforcing, and therefore it happens all the time?
Jaywalking.
Jaywalking. Jaywalking is the classic case. So the law is only as strong as the punishment around it. And what did we say a few classes ago about criminal enforcement and the internet? What is the major issue with punishing when it comes to the internet? There's a few different issues here.
Accountability, or yeah, accountability, I would say.
So say a little bit more what you mean by that, Marcus.
Like somebody can post something online and they won't be like punished for it because like it's like how can you really prove it at the same time? Like it's like also with the foreign immunity problem where like, oh, can you really punish somebody else from another country if they're not in the country?
Yeah, this is the case in which there's this issue with punishments where a punishment, you have to get access to that person to punish them. And so because very often it's around the world, if something is happening from somewhere else, it's going to be very difficult to discover and punish that person. So even if you know that this person is doing something illegal, if they're doing it from another place, then it doesn't really matter. So the law assumes that you have some control over the people who are breaking the law. But the very nature of the internet as a system that allows you to communicate over huge distances means that punishment doesn't really even work that well. You can't punish people, so the law has, in some sense, no teeth. It's really difficult to punish people who are breaking laws from somewhere else around the world. So that's another issue. Can anyone think of any other issues with the law and as a means for regulating? Go ahead.
Yeah, Professor, I mean, I had like a whole different train of thought right now. Is that punitive laws like don't really directly mean is you're gonna prevent people from doing things. I mean, like I've read some research where the more punitive your laws are, not necessarily mean you have like a safer kind of a society.
Yeah. And this is a major thing, is really laws as a means of regulation are really quite weak because one, they rely on punishment. And two, the fact is that just because something's illegal doesn't mean people aren't going to do it. And in fact, what can often happen is that it's not, as soon as something becomes illegal, very often the people who start dealing in it become a large organized crime. So for instance, in the United States, when prohibition happened in the 1920s, what was prohibition for those of you who?
Basically, the liquor was illegal.
Yeah, they made alcohol illegal in the United States. And did this lead to a decrease in crime and other sorts of things like that?
No, we actually had the mob had like a great source of income by.
Yeah, basically what it meant is instead of having alcohol out in the open and regulated in certain ways, basically the mob took over, and the major time in US history where the mafia and other groups were at their strongest was in the 20s, because they basically just cornered the liquor market and made huge profits because people weren't going to stop drinking. Instead, they just started doing it illegally. And as soon as it became illegal, you had people like Al Capone and other mobsters who made huge amounts of money selling this stuff. So the law, like basically every law will always be broken. And what they're finding is that in a lot of cases, the more punitive, I mean, there's a way with the law where if you go to such a degree of punitiveness that like anything you do, you're killed, it can lead to a decrease in law, or I mean in crime. However, most societies today don't want to kill everyone for like jaywalking. That seems excessive. And so once you have laws that are less than kill everyone all the time, then the law doesn't really have that much power in a lot of these cases. And things don't end up being they don't stop, they just move underground. And one of the issues with the internet is it has made it even easier than ever before to move crime underground in a certain sense. So there are ways to make yourself basically untraceable on the internet. There's new forms of currency on the internet that cannot be traced. And so the laws have always been weak to a certain degree as a means of control. And with the internet, they're just getting weaker because it's so much harder to punish and because it's so much easier to take your illegal operations underground. With the dark web, it is so easy to run drug smuggling operations, people smuggling operations. It is just so much easier than ever before to have these giant international crime syndicates. So that is another issue with regulating things by law. Does anyone have anything else that they want to talk about? So what we find right off the bat is the most natural way of thinking, let's regulate the internet. Well, let's go with the law. Well, the moment you start trying to regulate things in terms of the law, you run into practical issues very quickly. All right, so everyone on board with this? I'm going to put up the second. I'm going to erase the pros and cons, and we're now going to go with the second way of regulation, which is 2, norms. What are norms? Has anyone ever heard the notion of a norm or a social norm?
It's like it was expected to be like, oh, common.
So it's tied in with commonness. It's the expected behavior, or it's really the unwritten rules that you're supposed to do as a member of a specific society. So these include things, social standards, rules of politeness. So these are the things where if you do them, or if you don't follow them, you aren't literally going to go to jail. You aren't going to be punished. But instead, usually what happens is you feel judged by other members of society, or you get shunned or something like that. So what are some examples of norms and the fact is, we all follow norms. Yeah, people look at you funny. So one norm is respect your elders. So like, don't walk up to an old person and punch them in the face is an extreme version. But even things like, if an old person comes up to you and is like, can you help me? Don't just be like, you're old and gonna die soon, I'm not helping you. Like, that is to break a norm. Being quiet in a library, that's another good one. It's not technically against the rules, or at the very least, they might ask you to leave, but they're not going to arrest you for shouting in a library. But it is a norm, be quiet in a library. What are some others?
Professor, I'm thinking maybe like a cultural kind of thing is to greet people, you know?
Yeah. There are norms around greeting. So specifically, if you or I were to, if COVID wasn't happening, and you and I finally met face to face for the first time, how would we greet each other? We might wave. We would greet each other respectfully, but what actions would we engage in? Wave is a very good one. Handshake is another one. What else might we do? Handshake and wave are probably the two main ones. Maybe say hi. What wouldn't we do? Yeah, we probably would not hug. We almost certainly wouldn't kiss. We wouldn't start pounding on our chests and screaming at each other. Like, that is against the norms. there's technically nothing illegal if we hugged, but it would be really weird because we'd never met before. And also, our relationship is that of a student to a teacher. At the same time, if you were to come across your, you come home to see your father for like, you go away for spring break and you come home, or your mother, how do you greet your mom? You hug her. What would your mom do if you reached out your hand and was like, "Greetings, mother. It is good to see you." Yeah. Also, having a certain volume in your voice is also against social norms. Other ones, yeah, your mom would be really freaked out and feel offended. It's norm to wear clothes when you go out. That's a really good one, and it's not just a norm to wear clothes. It's a norm of what clothes to wear. So, for instance, if next time in class I came in just a full wedding dress, what would all of your responses be? Like if I just got up here to teach, yeah, you'd be amazed, you'd be confused, you'd be like, what? Why? Some people would be like, nice outfit, but it would certainly stand out. You'd not just be like, oh yeah, that's totally normal, like whatever. It would be very noticeable. So what norms are these unwritten rules about how we should and shouldn't behave. And what we find is norms provide very strong regulation around our behaviors. So for instance, let's think of a good classic example. Why do you hold the door for someone coming up behind you? There's basically two reasons for it.
Politeness.
One is politeness, and because you actually want to help the other person. But say you really don't like that person. You really don't want them and you don't really want to be nice to them. You still might hold the door. Why? Say you're in a crowded area. So it doesn't slam in their face.
You don't want the like scorn or shame or like any of the like bad effects.
Speaking bluntly, you don't want other people to think you're an asshole. Simple as that. Jorge.
Oh no, I was gonna say the same thing. Like you care about what everybody around you is gonna think about you.
Exactly. So there's this thing with norms. They are an incredibly strong way of controlling behavior because you don't want other people to judge you. And the way you know that this is so strong is just imagine the feeling in your chest if you were to break a norm. So for instance, has anyone ever, imagine getting in an elevator. So you walk into the elevator, doors open. What do you do in this circumstance? What is the next thing you do with your body? So imagine this person there.
You try to avoid facing people.
Yeah, you don't stand there like this, just looking at the strangers. You instead turn around and face the door. Think about how you would feel if you walked in and just faced the strangers and looked them in the eye the whole time. Just imagine doing that right now. What is the feeling in your chest that you have just imagining doing
that? Uncomfortability, awkwardness.
Yeah, or even like how many of you have watched a tourist do something in New York City that goes against the norms of New York? Like walking super slowly down the sidewalk.
Yeah, yeah.
You get annoyed with them. You just think like this is bad. Or sometimes if somebody like, it's especially a thing if like you go somewhere else and afterwards you discover like you go to somewhere where you never wear shoes in the house. Like that is a cultural thing. It is incredibly rude. And you wear your shoes. Afterwards, you feel this incredible amount of shame. So norms operate on this principle of shame or this principle of I'm feeling judged. So norms are a very strong way of governing behavior, in some ways even stronger than the law, because one of the quickest ways to get someone to break the law is just apply peer pressure to them of everyone's going to judge you if you don't do this thing. That's the way we can get many people to break the law. You know, underage drinking, the quickest way to get people to underage drink who don't want to break the law is you just get everyone else to make fun of them for it. So norms are incredibly powerful. However, norms are not a great way of regulating the internet for two reasons. What are the two reasons that norms cannot regulate the internet very well?
Oh, Professor, I was thinking you can do things anonymously. Like you don't have to worry about what people think about you personally.
Yeah, so here's one major issue with norms, is norms require people to feel shame and be embarrassed. So for instance, I'd be willing to bet that most of you pay much closer attention to the professor in person than you do on Zoom. I'd be willing to bet, I know, as a matter of fact, I'm that way. Times I've taken classes through the internet, I pay less attention to the professor. Why? Why do I do this? Why do I feel okay just reading news stories on the internet during class across Zoom? But in person, I feel I'm very much less likely to do so. Yeah.
You want the professor to know that you care about the class, and
Yeah, I cannot see your faces right now. Some number of you could be just like at the beach right now, and I have no idea, and aren't even near your computer. You just happen to have it open. So you can do whatever you want because you're anonymous. You can't feel that shame. In person, if you just stop paying attention, I can see it, and you can feel bad that I see it. Or even if you don't care what my views are, you don't want your fellow students to think you're a total jackass. On the internet, that's not a problem. You can say things on the internet and not feel like the other person knows it's you. If you face to face say something incredibly offensive, you feel bad about it. But on the internet, when you're hidden behind some screens, people are much more willing to say and do things that are really quite fucked up.
Yeah,
So for
Professor,
instance,
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say this is why Twitter is so toxic, Professor.
exactly. So norms, think about how people talk on Twitter versus how people talk face to face. Like, I'd be willing to bet that 95% of the people who make rape threats on the internet would never make rape threats face to face. And yeah, Howard says Reddit is more toxic. Yes, Reddit is even more toxic, and then 4chan's even more toxic than Reddit. But basically, online blogs where you have a username instead of your actual name is way, way more toxic. Why? Because you don't feel shame about saying these things, so the norms aren't really in place.
Yeah, Professor, I was gonna add to it that there are things that I've never heard people word like say things that I read on Twitter. Like I've never heard ever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another thing is like, how many of you play online like multiplayer video games?
I do.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any other people who play? All right. Yeah. Just think about usually within the first hour of playing online, somebody, if you are identify as a woman, or the other people identify you as a woman, within a second, you're being insulted or sexually harassed. If you lose, it's not like you should have done this differently. It's rather, you're a fucking girl, get off the internet. Also, the N-word comes out usually sometime within the first hour of playing. Now, I can say, as a matter of fact, I have never, I'm sure some people have, but the number of times I've played like competitive sports face to face, the number of times you hear a slur used is, I'd probably say in my life, I've not heard as many slurs as in like one round of Call of Duty or something like that. Why? Because people feel way more anonymous. People feel way more able to just say what's on their mind. So norms are very difficult to regulate the internet, because on the internet, you feel anonymous and you just don't give a crap. And so people will say things, do things because they think they can get away with it, or they don't see the pain this causes someone. So yeah, the internet, video games, online, because of the anonymousness, it's not in any way punished. You don't feel that shame. Also, if I were to start throwing around racial slurs in person, it's not going to be long until somebody comes along and punches me in the face, deservedly. If, however, I do it on the internet, there's that lack of, it's not just the shame, it's there's the, you are anonymous enough that no one's going to punch you in the face. So that's one issue. What's another reason that norms are a very ineffective way of governing the internet?
I mean like what we were talking about, like this comes from all sorts of cultures and countries, just different norms for different cultures and places.
I don't know if I just spelled differences right. So another issue is that there are differences around the world with norms. So what is an acceptable thing to say in one place is not an acceptable thing to say in the other. Back when we all communicated by voice or maybe by telephone, this wasn't going to lead to major issues. If certain words, like to take an example, there are certain words that are used as terms of endearment or greeting amongst certain groups that are just completely unacceptable amongst other groups. So I don't know how many of you have ever talked to Australians or hung around with Australians, but generally speaking, there are words that Australians use in everyday speech that if you were to say them in America would be considered deeply insulting. But in a context of all Australians, that's just the way they talk. In the same way, so what you have then is a situation in which somebody, because the norms are different, what can often happen is people will do things from one area that they have no idea are deeply upsetting. So for instance, if you don't grow up in the United States and you don't know the history behind the N-word, you don't understand the degree of pain that word can cause. So if you're somebody who English isn't your first language, you're interacting with people on the internet, you might not know that that is causing so much pain to somebody else. So because the norms are so different, you end up with people performing behaviors that are deeply upsetting to others without the intent, and it's simply because the norms are different worldwide. So does everyone understand in this case, norms do not work well with the internet?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. The third thing is market pressures. Does anyone know what it is to regulate something with market pressures? To go with a clear example, does any cigarettes in New York City? How much does a packet of cigarettes cost in New York City these days? Anyone know approximately?
It was like $10, $11 or something.
Yeah, it depends on where you are, but it's at least $10 and as many as like $15 to $20. Why are cigarettes that expensive?
Because the government wanted to like dissuade people from smoking.
Yeah, taxes. It's not that it costs $16 to make a packet of cigarettes. It's rather that the government puts large amounts of taxes on things like cigarettes. Why? To try to discourage people from using them. Or at the very least, if you're going to do this, then you're going to have to pay taxes on it. So this is what's called regulating by market pressures. Other things in this way are things like tariffs. So how was it that Trump attempted to reduce our reliance on goods from China? Well, he just put a tax such that any goods coming from China, you have to pay a little extra money for. So if it costs $1 in China to produce, but then you just say, and because it's coming to the United States, there's a 50-cent tax of buying Chinese goods. Well, now this is, well, in the United States, it costs say $1.25 because it costs $1.25 to produce. Well, then you're going to want to buy the local goods. So even if the Chinese goods are initially cheaper, you put some taxes on it to encourage people to buy the cheaper one. So that is regulating things by market pressures. Now, why is it that market pressures is not a super effective way of regulating things on the internet? What is it about the internet that makes us very ineffective as a means for regulating people's behavior?
Market isn't, they can't really, there's like, you can't really govern who does what, because there's so many people that like, it's actually like, what are you going to do? Have one person govern like the whole world by themselves?
That's, so again, we have the same problem as with the law. And it's just like the size of the internet means that you can't really apply market pressures. Basically, anytime a market pressure only works if you control the whole system. So in the United States, you put a tax on goods bought in the United States, but on the internet, it's not like there's a world government that controls the taxes on online goods. Also, basically, because of the nature of the internet and because of what Marcus was saying before about how there are places on the internet that you can basically be untraced, places on the dark web, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually stop somebody from selling it for less. In the United States, you cannot sell booze as a bar without paying taxes to the government because you're a physical space that they can come and close down. On the internet, though, you set up your website, you buy server space located in another country, all of a sudden it's very difficult to apply these market pressures. So everyone understand here with this last one. The final way of governing or regulating things is using architecture. What do we mean by architecture? Anyone know here? And architecture is in not like the sense of we're designing buildings, but you build into the architecture of the system.
Filters.
You basically put filters and things in place that make breaking the rules impossible. So for instance, at a liquor store, what is one of the ways that they prevent people from stealing? Say it's
Video cameras.
Yeah, security cameras or large bulletproof windows that you can't get through. How is it that the Pentagon keeps people out? Well, they put in big ass doors. So architecture, you literally make it impossible for somebody to break the rules. So of all the means of regulation, architecture is the strongest. If you make something impossible to do, then nobody's going to do it. So for instance, if you were to we wouldn't have to worry about gun control laws if somebody magically snapped their fingers and destroyed all the guns, like just made guns impossible. If guns became impossible, we wouldn't need laws. So that's how you can do things with architecture. Now, with the internet, this is the main, as a matter of fact, with technology, this is the main way in which things get regulated. Regulation happens by building into the code of a program or building into the hardware of a system that certain things are impossible. So for instance, why was it impossible for Donald Trump at Donald Trump to use Twitter anymore? What was it that regulated his use of Twitter? Who controlled it and what did they do?
Twitter controlled it, and either somebody who worked at Twitter was given the order to block at real Donald Trump, like the whole account itself, and permanently ban it, or and censor any other attempts to post the same message across the other accounts.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. They physically. Why did Trump stop tweeting? It's not that they made it illegal. It's not that people shamed him. It's not that they made him pay $10 million per tweet. It's rather that Twitter blocked the account and literally made it impossible for Donald Trump to post anything ever again. So architecture, or in the modern world, it's in terms of code. So as the Trump blocking demonstrates, as a matter of practical fact, it is very easy to regulate the internet. Well, no, that's not entirely true. Of the 4 ways of regulating computer technology, it is rather easy to regulate it comparatively using code or architecture. However, it raises some problems. So one issue is what? What are some issues that come up regulating using architecture or code? Jorge.
Professor, I was thinking this architecture code, it depends who codes this, so it's usually the private company.
So there are ethical issues off the bat. So one thing that is a problem is, in the United States, who writes the laws? The people. At least in theory, we pass it up through our democratic government. But at the very least, we have some say. Who determines the norms? Well, they're somewhat harder to control, but it ultimately comes down to how we behave. So for instance, why is it that homosexuality today is more accepted, or you are far less likely to be judged than it was 50 years ago? Well, because we as a population are more willing and accepting of homosexual individuals. The norms changed because we as a society, it took a while and it's still not perfect by any means. I'm not trying to dismiss and say the world is a perfect place now. It's just the world is better now with respect to these things because we as a society, we as individuals changed. Market pressures. usually these are put in place for the well-being of the society. The government puts it in, and you might disagree with the details, but the government doesn't put taxes on cigarettes simply to make people who smoke suffer. It's rather to discourage them and make the world a better place. But when it comes to code, who decides who can go on? Well, the company who writes the code. And this can lead to some problems. What's another issue, though, with code and architecture? When very often, remember we talked about the last class before break with illegal like downloading of movies and things like that? Very often, there'll be a website that you can go to illegally download movies. Every so often, what happens to these websites?
Or they get
Uh,
taken down.
Yeah.
Professor, can I say something else also? This thing is really tied with your profit motives. You know, that's for the most important aspect of your business. You know.
So Jorge, let me pause you for 1 sec. So what I want to say is that I want to come back to you. I want to finish this second issue, pause, run to the bathroom, come back, and then we're going to talk about the issues around things like Twitter and the profit desires driving things and all the issues of why, on the one hand, Twitter banning Trump is a good thing in a certain sense, and why, on the other hand, it's a very bad and should be troubling thing. So let me save what you were going to say in terms of details here and working it out, because you're spot on, and I want to come back to that point. But I first want to finish this second issue with architecture and code. So Marcus, what did you say can sometimes happen with these websites?
Yeah, they could get taken down, and also it's damn hard to like do anything like, because if you put a filter in, you can like, oh, if somebody puts a certain swear word and they filter that, pretty much anybody who uses that would probably get like taken down.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is they will take it down. However, the nature of the human mind and the internet is such that within a week, what has usually happened?
Another one comes up.
Another one takes its place. So an issue with architecture and code is, in some cases, it's very easy to, if you have a control over a system like Twitter, it is your company, something like that, you can regulate it with code or architecture pretty easily. However, the issue is from the outside, it is incredibly difficult to regulate the architecture of the internet, because what will happen is a new one will pop back up immediately. So you shut down one drug running website, a new one's up within 10 minutes. You shut down, you put a filter on something, within 2 days, somebody's found a different word to use as a stand-in. Or if you filter the word F-U-C-K, then all of a sudden people just start putting in like they start spelling it this way. And all of a sudden you end up, and so what can end up happening is what you end up with is what are originally perfectly innocuous images come to have very mean-spirited or very problematic meanings, because every time you knock down one issue, another one pops up. So that's the final issue with code, is on the one hand, it's incredibly strong if the company is writing into its own code and they provide something that no one else can provide. If, however, you're trying to stop someone from the outside by shutting down their website, doing this, it's incredibly difficult because somebody can just make a new one. So, you know, every time a child pornography website gets shut down, a new one pops up. Every time an internet's like drug sales website goes down, a new one pops up. So any way you try to regulate on the internet is incredibly difficult. All right. I'm going to take a 2-second break, run to the bathroom, and then we're going to come back and jump into what Jorge was saying about the potential ethical issues around regulating things by code, because what ends up driving companies like Twitter is very often profit sorts of things. And I just want to tease out some of the sort of implications with that. All right. I'll be back in like 2 minutes. If you need a 2-minute break, feel free to step away. All right. Everyone hear me okay? We're back?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, awesome. All right. Here's the simple question, and this is going to raise a lot of bigger picture questions, but simply put, was Twitter right to ban @RealDonaldTrump?
They had the power to.
So right in the sense of, yes, they were able to, but ethically right, morally right. Was it acceptable that Twitter banned Trump? We can talk out the positives and the negatives. But Marcus, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I guess like it depends on the person. Of course, there's always two different sides, but or at least different sides to it. But I think they were right because it might have taken a hit on their company itself because people were like pressuring them to ban Donald Trump because they don't like Donald Trump. So like, and what he said like did offend a lot of people. So like, yeah, they did. It was a better move.
So here's one thing. We have one, were they right? Well, one thing is his comments caused harm and offended people. So on the one hand, like, yes, what he said some heinous things, and he said some things which led people to people who said, like, I heard what the president said, and therefore I stormed the Capitol. Also, there's this element of what Cynthia just said is you signed up and agreed to their terms of service. So when you join any platform or any sort of website, you have that yes, I agree page. So on the one hand, you signed up, agreed to their terms of service. Therefore, they have the right or the ethical ability to ban you. However, what are some potential worries about this? Jorge.
Oh, Professor, I was thinking about that in the long run is probably not such a great thing because this is just I think, a result. The banning of Donald Trump is a result of them being, Twitter being unregulated by the government, and allowing all this sorts of speech for years and years and years.
So on the one hand, we have like in the short term, we can go, yes, Donald Trump got banned, good things happen. But the flip side is things like this. As Howard says, nobody reads the terms of service. And as a matter of fact, that's just like a matter of fact, nobody ever reads those damn things. Because of this, is it really right to say that like you signed it away? And as a matter of fact, why are terms of service so long and complicated? Who decided to make them that way? And why are
Lawmakers
they that way?
or lawyers and like the company lawyers to protect them.
Yeah, exactly. They make them so long, in part, as exactly what Cynthia says, so nobody reads them. They can put things into those terms of service so that you agree to things that if you understood them, you'd never agree to. So there's this element in which, like, yes, we agreed to the terms of service, and yes, Trump was doing some bad things, but there are these big picture implications of what Jorge was saying, of like, why was it that why was it that Twitter had to ban real Donald Trump and not the government? Or why was it Twitter and not the government? Well, the government doesn't have, in some sense, the ability to regulate real Donald Trump. And why is that a problem? Why should we be worried that the person deciding whether we should ban somebody on Twitter is Twitter? What is the worry here?
Control. Like really, like do you really trust them? Like, because it's whoever like is can control Twitter that bans people, and you can what am I trying to say? It's like China, where you have China's government mass controls and monitors the people, like the people on the internet and their use. But at the same time, it doesn't matter if it's Twitter, the government. There's always going to be like that fear of like somebody's going to be doing like something illegal and covering it up.
Yeah. So there's this worry of there these conflicts of interest where why did Twitter ban real Donald Trump? Well, on the one hand, it's, he violated the terms of service and he offended people. But the man had been offending people and violating terms of service for years, and many people had. Jorge.
Professor, I was going to say also, Twitter's decisions are informed on what is good for their company. They care about their company and their bottom line.
Why? So to take another example, what recently happened down in Georgia? Anyone who's been following the news, anyone know what happened in Georgia very recently?
Does it have to do with is it border ID laws or?
Yeah. They passed a bunch of new laws which makes it harder to vote. Basically, none of these laws say things like if you are a person of color, you can't vote. Instead, they include things like you can no longer hand out bottled water and food at polling places. You can no longer vote if you don't have a driver's license. You can no longer vote if you do not sign up 6 weeks in advance. So why are these laws troubling to people? Why is it that people are like, whoa, whoa, this is a problem?
because they want to be able to vote, like,
Yeah.
and just be able to do what they want. But at the
Yeah.
same time, that like what you said with the food and water, that's technically a form of bribery.
So that's the argument that they make is it's a form of bribery. But why? What's the argument that says these laws are discriminatory? Why are people worried that these laws are problematic, Jorge?
Yeah, Professor, because I was reading that the research shows that the more roadblocks you put up, the people that you actually suppressible is minorities and poor people that don't have the time or resources. Also, Professor, one thing that it was out in the open actually. They banned Sunday voting, and that was a big day for African American people to go out and vote right after church service.
Yeah. So all of these things are not explicitly racist or classist or against anything. But when you pause and think about them, who needs water and food to stand on a voting line? What sorts of people? Is it going to be people who live out in rural areas, or is it going to be people who live in inner cities? Who's going to need food and water on those lines?
People that are really poor and can't even afford that.
So part of it is going to be people who are poor, but also if you're standing on a line for 3 hours, you might get thirsty. If you're standing on a line for 3 minutes, you're not going to get thirsty. And where are the lines longer? In the cities or in the rural country areas?
Cities.
Cities, they're longer. Who on average lives in cities more often? People of if you're looking for rural areas demographically are generally higher percentages of what race compared to cities?
Like white or
Yeah.
like any other race, but minorities are usually in cities.
People of color, as for economic and historical reasons, there are generally higher percentages of people of color in cities. So what you end up doing effectively is saying, we are going to make it harder for people in cities to vote, which is effectively saying we are making it harder for people of color to vote, because as a matter of fact, people of color are the ones are a higher percentage in the city than in the suburbs. In this, so what ended up happening is there was these new laws put in place, which, while not explicitly racist, very clearly are designed to make it more difficult for people of color to vote. So down in Georgia, there are 2 major companies that are headquartered there. Anyone out of curiosity know what the 2 largest companies headquartered in Georgia are? I'll give you, we can play, yeah, Coca-Cola is one. Turner, I think, might be third, but Turner's up there as well. Turner TBS, Turner Broadcasting System. One is Coke, and the other is the, I'll give you a clue. It's going to be the worst one of these ever drawn. We're looking from above. Yeah, that's a plane. Delta, exactly. Delta Airlines, which I'm pretty sure is the largest airline company in the world in terms of number of flights. Delta is a huge airline. They're headquartered in Atlanta, which is why Atlanta is the largest airport in the world in terms of number of flights each day. So as these votes were getting, these votes were coming out, these new voting rules were coming out. Coke and Delta, what did they say? Anyone know? As the rules were getting passed. You're all giving me the correct answer right now, by the way. Before the rules got passed, and as they were getting passed, Coke and American Airlines, or Coke and Delta said nothing. They were completely silent. Very recently, Coke and Delta have come out and spoken against these new laws. What changed? Why is it that Coke and Delta didn't speak before and are speaking now?
they made the decision in terms of the company. Like I think it was like China. They didn't celebrate um Joe Biden's thing, and then they like later on, like after a little bit of time, they're like, oh okay, yeah, I'm fine with it. And now like Coke is doing the same thing where like, oh, they made the decision that it's in their company interest to support it, because if they don't like if they don't support or if they don't say anything about it, they're gonna look bad in front of them, like the millions of their followers, and they might lose a lot of profit.
Yeah, so that's the key. What changed? Well, people started threatening to boycott, and they all of a sudden realized, oh, it's not like they suddenly were like, you know what, we should have been saying it from the beginning. Rather, while the voting was going on, they didn't say anything, presumably because they considered, like, oh, you know what? We don't want to piss off our wealthy donors and speak now. But now that it's happened, we're going to lose money if we don't say anything. So, what you end up with are these cases in which there are these major conflicts of interest, and Twitter presumably banned Donald Trump at this point, in part because it started affecting people's views of Twitter and had the possibility of affecting their bottom line, their money. So there's this major conflict of interest when the person doing the regulating is themselves. And on the internet, that's the main way that things get regulated. Why is it that most video games you buy make it so that you can't copy the video game and give it to somebody else? What is the main reason behind that? What is their driving force?
They don't want you to sell their intellectual property for half the
Yeah.
price.
Yeah, they don't want
Or
you to
free.
sell that. It's a money-driven sort of thing. Now, there might be ethical reasons not to as well. Like if somebody worked on this game, we want it to be the case that they get a profit, they are rewarded for it. But strictly speaking, like why is it that a Microsoft Office has that little code at the start that you have to enter and you can only use it on one website of blah 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 blah? Well, it's because they want to make money. That is the decision-making process. So there's this major issue here with Twitter banning Donald Trump in this particular case is an okay sort of thing. I think like very few people want to say like in a vacuum, banning a person who incites violence is a bad thing. However, it's within this general context. What's to stop Twitter in the future from banning people for saying things that you are, the next thing they might ban someone you like for saying something, or they might decide that this, that, and the other is not okay because it potentially upsets people. So there's this major worry here of these conflicts of interests and companies themselves preventing certain things from being discussed or said for reasons that are not for the common good, but entirely for their own benefits. So that's the major issue here with this. And then what's another tied in issue? A lot of so what is another reason we should be worried about Twitter being the ones deciding what should and shouldn't be allowed to be said? Part of it is this conflict of interest and the driving force is money. But more generally speaking, what is the worry here?
It violates our freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. And this is exactly what I want to bring up, is there's now this major issue with the internet of, and this is probably we're going to finish today. I don't feel like running overtime or anything, and I'm sure you all could still use a little break. So we're going to not discuss porn unless anyone really wants to talk about porn. But what we're going to talk about is free speech. So free speech is an issue that comes up a lot within the realm of the internet. And one of the things that is a worry about Twitter banning Donald Trump is this issue of free speech. And what the issue is that it used to be the case that, well, how did we talk to each other 2,000 years ago?
More polite. Like it's
sorry, my question was poorly worded. I don't mean politeness, impolite. I mean physically, what was the medium by which we communicated with each other 2,000 years ago?
Face-to-face, Professor?
Mm-hmm.
No, it was no other way.
Mm-hmm. Face-to-face, sound in the air, reading lips, maybe writing down. So the only medium that was controlling this was face to face. So who had the, if you wanted to prevent someone from saying something, what would you do?
Physically, I guess, shutting their mouth.
Yeah, you'd physically shut their mouth, very often by hitting them over the head with a rock. That was how you could control free speech. So it came down to whoever had the physical ability to stop people from talking became the ones who were able to do this. So free speech is when you're allowed to say whatever you want without any consequences. So there's been this push and pull throughout history of wanting to have people be allowed to say what they want while also not wanting them to be able to say anything at all. So very often, why is it that we value free speech? What is it about free speech that we like? Why do we not want our free speech taken away?
It allows
Who do
us
we-
to express our ideas, beliefs, and like other issues.
Yeah, we want to be able to express our beliefs, ideas, and everything else. And what's the worry if we don't have free speech? What is the potential problem?
Everybody would be suppressed, and whoever's in power would. It's like the monarchy. Like you be put to death if you say this.
Yeah, so exactly. The worry of a lack of free speech is who's taking your free speech away. Well, very often it's a powerful organization that doesn't want you saying things, which usually means the government. So in past times, if you say something the government doesn't like, they arrest you, they put you in jail, that's that. So in the United States, we felt that we do not, part of the like founding ideals were we didn't want a government to be over controlling the people. So we wrote into our law certain free speech laws. Most notably, what's the most notable free speech law in the United States? Anyone know? It's in the Constitution.
First Amendment.
First Amendment.
Yeah, First Amendment. So the First Amendment is the law we have governing free speech. And the reason that the First Amendment exists, it says the government cannot step in and prevent you from saying things. And you can see how in the past, just about the only organization that had the power to shut you up and not have you say things was the government. The government was the only organization with a legal ability who could legally shut you up because they controlled the laws. And so we built into the law that they couldn't shut you up. Now, why is this coming up in the context of Twitter? Well, nowadays, the media through which we communicate are not like they were. Back in the day, it was face to face. No one controlled the air. Nowadays, or then technology started changing. Then we started having things like TV and radio. TV and radio, who controlled what could be on the TV and the radio?
The radio channel.
The radio channel, but who
And
did they
TV.
have to talk to agree?
I think it's like the FCC is,
Yeah, it
is
was-
the government.
Yeah, it's the FCC, i.e. the government. So back in the day, face to face, the government had the ultimate decision. Then here, the FCC had the decision. And why were they able to do it? Well, because the number of television channels and radio was pretty well controlled. Nowadays, we've got the internet. Who controls what you're allowed to say on the internet and what you're not allowed to say on the internet? There's basically two possible answers. One is no one, and the other is companies that own platforms. So there's this worry here with the internet of there's been this major shift of governments being the ones controlling what is out there, and free speech being a question between the government and the not government. Two cases in which the people who own the platforms are the one governing it, which means that for the first time really in our history, we have cases in which private companies are coming face to face with the First Amendment. The First Amendment, strictly speaking, legally, a company, as long as they're not being discriminatory, is allowed to shut you up for saying things on their platform that they don't like. So when people say like, you are violating my First Amendment rights, Twitter, by shutting Donald Trump up, that's legally speaking wrong. Twitter has no obligation to meet the First Amendment. In the same way that your father can kick you out of the house if you wear certain types of clothes, Twitter can kick you off Twitter for posting things it doesn't like. However, the major difference is your father in your house is one person controlling one person. Twitter and the internet is a company that controls one of the major communication networks for billions of people worldwide. And that can be a worry. That can be a question of there's just this major issue of should we really have it be the case that Twitter is the one regulating the internet? Do we really want it now that instead of a government being the one who we have to worry about, it's Twitter being the one we have to worry about? And there's arguments on both sides of this sort of issue. But does everyone see the major difference here? How having Twitter or Facebook controlling what can and cannot be said on their platform is a very different thing from the FCC deciding what can be on the TV or radio. It's just a fundamental shift, and we might worry like this is a problem.
Yeah. Also to go with that, technically we don't exactly have full free speech because there's things like, oh, we can't say fire in a theater.
I'm so glad that was a really nice transition, Marcus. So free speech, what legally speaking is free speech and what is illegal? So free speech does not mean you're allowed to say anything you want. Specifically, you are not in the United States allowed to engage in harm speech. So what is harm speech? Anyone know?
Death threats, like saying I'll kill somebody or like I'll kill you because of this or whatever.
Yeah.
Because it's basically any like thing that can cause injury or harm to other people. Yeah.
So two things. So I'm going to respond to Cynthia's point. She says her Catholic school apparently had a limited freedom of speech within their handbook. And exactly because a private organization has control over their own things, they can limit things beyond what the government does. And because of that, it's basically your Catholic school, though, is a limited organization. The worry is that what happens when instead of a Catholic school limiting it, Twitter is limiting it? And what if Twitter starts saying things like, you know what? You're not allowed to discuss politics on Twitter at all. Or, you know what? I really like dogs. So here on Twitter, you're never allowed to say cats are better than dogs. That's not allowed. And if you do, you will be shut down. You can see how it's a very slippery slope where we start to run into problems where, well, yes, in the particular case of Donald Trump, we might say like, yes, it's a good thing that they are shutting him down. But on the flip side, you can worry like, okay, but where do you stop? In this case, they agreed, but what about the next step? And on the flip side, you might worry that maybe they don't regulate enough. But back to this point with harm speech. So Marcus said, you're not allowed to threaten people. Exactly. That's one thing you're not allowed to do in the United States. I'm not allowed to walk up to tell someone and threaten to kill them. Seriously, as like that counts as harm speech. What else aren't you allowed to say? Anyone know?
I think you can't like make some like gender or like it's like I guess it's like because I think there are some laws in like the country where like you can't misgenderify people because like nowadays like we have a movement of genderifying people's sexualities and other like different types of issues.
So those issues are coming up and they're really at so I'm going to save that sort of issue for a second because that's one that's really on the border of what counts as free speech and what counts as hate speech or harm speech and where to draw the line between hate and harm. But in a classic harm speech case, you actually said the one before, Marcus, with yelling fire in a crowded theater, where your goal is to cause a stampede and create chaos. So anything that has the explicit ability to cause large amounts of physical harm counts as harm speech. You're also not allowed to put up like the blueprint for a homemade bomb and give it out to children at a school. That's also not something that's allowed. So that's what we mean by harm speech. The issue really comes down, though, for the line between hate speech and harm speech. So what do we typically mean by hate speech?
discriminatory, like saying like that, oh, this race is bad, this, like, it's basically like the coronavirus is like, now people like Chinese people are Asian, like, in mostly Chinese, like, specifically because corona started in China, so like you can't, and now people are saying like, oh, like, coronavirus, whatever, and like other names and stuff.
All of these count as hate speech. What hate speech is basically saying hateful things about a group of people. It's saying hateful things about people because they are members of a certain racial group or ethnic group or religious group or anything like that. That's hate speech. Now, the reason that this comes up is because, strictly speaking, within the United States of America, hate speech is perfectly legal under the First Amendment. The government cannot punish you for saying hateful things about a certain group of people. They can punish you for saying harmful things about them. So if you say X group of people are bad and stupid, they can't put you in trouble. The moment you say, therefore, we need to round them up and kill them, that becomes harm speech that you can be punished for. And the issue is that the line here is very blurry. And it's only gotten blurrier thanks to the internet. Because the nature of the internet is such that it can turn hate speech into harm speech very quickly. And what is intended simply as hate speech becomes harm speech based on how people take it. So Howard says people are getting arrested for hate speech now. It depends on what type of hate speech it is. And different sorts of laws around it, but new places are trying to pass hate speech laws. So for instance, I'm pretty sure that Georgia is trying to put in place new hate speech laws tied in with the shootings in the massage parlors. And so places can put in more strict laws than the First Amendment allows. But by the First Amendment, hate speech is technically legal as long as you don't cross the line into harm speech. And ultimately, what you can kind of think of the disagreement between Trump and his second impeachment, Trump's second impeachment was basically came down to when he was saying fight like hell for me, was he intending that in more of a free speech, hate speech sort of way of we hate the people who are trying to keep us down, or was he saying much more explicitly riot, cause harm for people? And basically what the Democrats were trying to argue is this is what happened. It was harm speech. He was claiming at worst it was hate speech, and maybe it wasn't even that. And you can see why this led to a problem and why the line between hate and harm is getting so much more blurry. So what's another reason that the internet is making this line between hate and harm tougher to identify?
There's not really a law like that like applies to it, I guess, because people are like because of the anonymity. But at the same time, most of the people, like, you grow kind of numb to it, I guess, over time, because like people, it's so common on the internet that like it's just like normalcy, or it's just like okay, it's like whatever. Like people, you don't even see that person again, so it's like I don't really care like what I say on the internet, and like it doesn't affect me really in any way, and it shouldn't affect the other person because like they haven't done it, like it shouldn't affect them like physically.
Yeah, so this is one thing with the internet is one thing about the internet is an individual act of hate speech could, in the old days, you get one act of hate speech, then you'd walk away and it would be very troubling, but you could then go home and be in a safe space. Nowadays, though, you as the giver of the hate speech might not think of it as an especially big deal because it happens so much. But if you're somebody who's getting thousands of hateful messages every single day saying things like you should kill yourself or you don't deserve to live or things like that, it can feel and it can cause genuine harm. So things that in the old days, because of the nature of face-to-face communication, would not really be able to be called harm speech, nowadays, these very same things are causing very obvious physical harm. Another issue is, if you were to be standing with your friend and you're clearly face to face. Like you and I were to be jokingly saying something. Imagine you and a friend were walking down the street. I'm trying to say this in a way that cannot possibly be interpreted in a really hateful, harmful manner. If I'm joking face to face and I say something like, oh, I tell my friend, oh, you're such an idiot. Like, are you sure you have a functioning brain or something like that? If I say that face to face and I'm laughing while I'm doing it and we know each other, it's going to be pretty clear that I'm joking. You go on the internet, though. What's the major issue here?
You're not face to face. You can't you can't hear them most of the time because it's all in text. So if you're looking at through context of like a whole like chat log, right, and you're not familiar with the person, it could be determined as harm.
Yeah, there's no facial expressions. There's no tone of voice. So what ends up happening is it's much easier for somebody to misinterpret what someone else is saying. So somebody might say something that they intend to either be a joke or maybe as low-end hate speech. And this is what Trump, a lot of the arguments around this, and when people say very hateful things on the internet, they will say things like, I mean, I was just speaking my mind. I did not intend harm to come. But if somebody else sees this and like, you know, you read online or you write online, people of this race deserve to die. Well, you may have said that in a way that was like very hateful, but not actually saying anyone should go out and kill anybody. But if you're in a position of power and somebody reads that, they might think, well, this person wants me to go and kill minorities and goes out and does it. And now all of a sudden, is that thing which you thought was just hate speech really just hate speech? Or is it really harm speech? There isn't a clear answer because it's so hard and there's so little context and it's so easy to have misunderstandings. A lot of times threats, you know, what counts as a threat? If I'm coming after you with a knife and I say I'm going to kill you face to face, it's pretty clear that I'm threatening you. If, however, I say you deserve to die on the internet, no context, that might be considered a threat. It might not, depending on who's reading it, how they're reading it. So it just gets really hard to apply these laws here. And which leads us back to something that we talked about in earlier classes, which is these days, because these sorts of things are so blurry, what's the main way in which people get punished for saying hateful things on the internet? What is the main mechanism by which we stop people who say hateful things?
We block them.
Yeah, we block them. Or what ends up happening to a person? If you make a off-color joke that upsets a lot of people, what might end up happening to you?
Backlash, cancel culture.
Cancel culture steps in, which is another worry here, which is because there are no other mechanisms in place, cancel culture can step in. And in a lot of cases, on an individual case-by-case basis, we can think of many cases in which, okay, cancel culture had a positive benefit. We think, oh, this person did something terrible. We don't want them to be a famous person anymore. However, where do you draw the line? Cancel culture, it seems like it can overstep its bounds and go a little too far in certain sorts of cases. And there is this major worry of when the actual population is the one deciding what should and shouldn't be said. You know, the average person is very easy and to manipulate, and I include myself in that. You get us angry, we will end up doing things that might be over the top or harmful. And as we said a few classes ago, once something gets on the internet, it's not going away. It's staying there forever. Does anyone have any last thoughts about this free speech, hate speech, harm speech sorts of issues with the internet and why the internet is making these things so much more problematic? There's something else we'll be talking about in a few more classes along these lines, which is typically called group polarization. And another issue with hate speech and the internet is because groups of people on the internet can only are capable of talking only to other people with similar views to them, simple hate speech can lead to radicalization in a way that doesn't happen if you aren't on the internet. So we're going to save that a bit more for our community class down the line, but that's something else to keep in mind. All right. How's everyone doing energy wise? How are we holding up?
We're good. I'm good. Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
It's not related to the class, but I wasn't able to, I mean, not related to today. I wasn't able to attend last class. I couldn't find the video.
The video, I had a little trouble downloading it. I finally downloaded it this morning. I'm gonna post it this afternoon when I post this one. I was having a little technical issues with the computer, but it will be up this afternoon. Thank you for reminding me though.
Thanks.
All right, so here's the question. You know what? We've officially got 25 minutes left. Let's just go for it and talk about porn. We're gonna finally discuss porn as another way in which, like another case study to show why it's so hard to regulate the internet. Pornography is something which, depending on your culture, is viewed very differently. And so part of the issue with porn and the internet is that because porn can be accessed from anywhere in the world, there are lots of issues surrounding just what should be acceptable and what should not be. So one of the issues is not every type of porn is legal everywhere in the world. So in the United States, there are certain sorts of things which are not allowed to be shown in pornographic settings. These include things like child pornography and any sort of violence in pornography. The issue is that we don't really have laws that are very straightforward and easy to interpret around what counts as unacceptable and not unacceptable in a pornographic situation. So the way the law writes it is that you are not allowed, with a legal definition, one of the definitions of pornography that is illegal is if it depicts things in a patently offensive manner as judged by a reasonable person aware of community standards. So the reason I'm bringing up pornography here, just to like explain the general gist, is that pornography provides a really nice, clear case in which the laws we have do not line up well with the facts of the matter, and therefore attempting to apply regulation on the internet just becomes very, very difficult. So right off the bat, one of the definitions of pornographic images that are illegal in the United States is that they depict things in a patently offensive manner as judged by a reasonable person aware of community standards. Why is this going to lead to practical problems when it comes to deciding what should or shouldn't be illegal on the internet? Practical issues here. What is an issue when we're trying to judge things by community standards on the internet?
You can't really tell if they are actually part of that community.
How do you define community here? If somebody's viewing this website from somewhere else around the world where certain sorts of sexual activities just don't happen, then what on earth does this suddenly get deemed inappropriate? Like, what sort of thing is this now illegal simply because we don't have straightforward community standards? So what, right off the bat, you can see we want laws that allow certain types of things and not other types of things. We have a law here, but the law is itself very vague and difficult. Now, you might think, all right, porn in general is difficult to put laws on, but what about child porn? we have a straightforward definition of child porn, right? We have a straightforward understanding that child pornography is wrong and we shouldn't allow child pornography. But can anyone already start to see, based on the nature of the internet and computer technology, why even coming up with a law for something like child porn becomes problematic?
Professor, from
Yeah.
what I read in the book,
Mhm.
the depiction, as Marcus was saying, like you could be playing underage person, but what if you're not an actual underage person? Would that still be child porn?
Yeah, so here's an issue. Child pornography, it's very unclear what counts as child pornography. So it's very clear in the extreme cases. So if you have two consenting adults engaging in sexual activity, it is not child porn. That is just pornography. Also, on the flip side, if you have one fully grown adult and one person who is like 10 years old, actual living, breathing person, that clearly is child pornography. And why do we want to separate child pornography from non-child pornography? What is the reason that we put special, like just, why do we put special laws around child porn? What is the reasoning behind that? As a society, why don't we want child porn?
Professor, I think it's because you, as a young person, you cannot make those decisions for yourself. You're
Exactly.
not mature enough.
It is about keeping, if a child, children cannot consent in sexual activities. They do not understand what they're getting through, and we do not want harm to come to children engaged in these sexual activities. And we do not want there to be a market for people to buy up these things. Basically, it's about protecting children. It's about taking care of children and preventing a world in which children are getting sexually exploited. And so the reason we want to draw that line is we don't want to have a world in which children are getting sexually exploited. So because of this, we have these child pornography laws, and we have laws that say things like, we do not want images depicting children having sex. However, there's a major blurry area around what counts as depicting a child having sex. So for instance, what happens if you have somebody who's a consenting adult, but is dressed to look like a non-consenting adult? Or to take a more problematic issue, what if this video is of a computer-generated person designed to look like a child engaging in sexual activity? So we know that over here, actual child having sex with actual adult, bad. Actual adult having sex with other actual adult, fine. What do you do if it's actual adult depicted having sex with computer-generated child? Should the person who creates this image be charged with child pornography? So does everyone see the issue here around this? Of we don't have a way of defining, thanks to new computer technology, what even counts as child pornography. So what do people think? Is an image in which a computer-generated individual depicted having sex with an adult, is that child porn? On the one, like the thinking is basically, what are the reasons to think yes, this is child porn? What is the reason to think yes, computer-generated version of a child having sex with an adult counts as child porn?
It's because like what you said, like that it's actually it has the image of a child.
It looks like a child having sex. And in some sense, that's the definition of child porn. You could also not know that this isn't a real pornographic image. On the no side, though, what's the reason to think that no, this shouldn't be treated as child porn? This is something else.
It's not actually a child doing it.
No child. We said before, we want children can't consent. We're trying to protect the child. Well, we don't care about what happens to the computer-generated children because they aren't real. So on the flip side, maybe we shouldn't care about this. Jorge.
When I was going to say the same thing, they might argue that there is not an actual person being harmed directly.
Yeah, so
But-
exactly, we're trying to protect the children. When people are saying we need to protect the children, they generally have in mind actual physical children, not imaginary ones. We don't have special laws protecting your imaginary friend that's a child. It's imaginary. In the same way, nobody gets upset when computer generated characters get killed in movies. They're computer generated. So should we care that this sort of child is being, this computer generated child is being harmed? Well, the issue is, legally speaking, we don't have a clear answer on this. Another issue that comes up is even something like possessing a pornographic image isn't clear, or possessing knowingly possessing a child pornographic image. If you're, because of the nature of the internet now and things just being sent to you, if an email is sent to you depicting somebody who, as a matter of fact, is 17, did you just knowingly collect child pornography?
Oh, Professor, I was going to say also, you might need, if you want a different law, directly to those people that are attracted to that kind of
Yeah.
thing, you know?
Yeah, and what this is really highlighting is we had these laws designed to protect children, and the nature of modern technology is such that it is making those laws completely difficult to apply in these cases. So what ends up happening is we end up with applying the laws of the person who makes computer generated pornography the same as the laws of somebody who's actually engaging in sex with a child. And clearly, even if you think that child pornography with computer generated images is bad and should be illegal, I don't think anybody thinks that it's quite as bad as somebody who actually sexually exploits a child. On the same flip side, we also have cases that I talked about before of teenagers engaging in consensual exchanging of nude photos of themselves being charged with child pornography, because those are the only laws we have around this stuff. We don't have laws governing sexting as something different from pornography defined in the old days where you get a movie studio involved. So what pornography really does is just give us a final clear case of when we're trying to understand how to regulate and why it's so complicated. Let's take something as clear-cut as porn and child porn. And it doesn't even work in this case. So really what this little quick, it's kind of just a case study proving the point of the law is incredibly difficult to apply in cyberspace for all the reasons we talked about. And even when you go to the simplest cases, or what you'd think are the simplest cases, modern technology makes it very difficult to know what is and isn't illegal based on the laws we have now. And so it looks like we need new laws, we need new practices. The problem is, for all the reasons that I said earlier in class, it's difficult to come up with laws or norms or anything to govern. So if you're ever wondering, like, why is the internet such a cesspool of people doing bad things? It's just built into the nature of the internet that it is very difficult to regulate and govern it. And part of the idea behind the internet is it's supposed to be unregulated. It's based off this idea that everyone should be allowed to say and do what they want to increase freedom of speech and every other sort of thing. All right, I'm out of gas. My ribs are hurting and my throat hurts. So does anyone want to bring up anything here at the end of class about anything we talked about at all during class today? Any takers?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
I can't think of anything right now.
Right, the last thing I want to say, for those of you who came in late, you're not going to get the papers back till next Friday because I did not have a chance to grade them. I was traveling and then I had a funeral I had to attend, so I did not get the time. You will get them back by next Friday before class. I will talk about a few things in class on Friday. In that case, I will see you all next week and have a great weekend. And I will, Jorge and anyone else who's interested in watching the video from last time, I will be posting it this afternoon.